What time is it? It's Meccano time! Hi and welcome back. This week's build is from the 1930s Aeroplane constructor set, and it's the third model, the low wing interceptor. I love this set. Of all my Meccano I have, this has to be my favourite. Can't explain why. I'm not sure if it's a period in time. There is something about the 1920s and 1930s that fascinates me. Maybe because it was a time when Indiana Jones was roaming the world. Maybe it is because it is the last time the planet was still truly wild. You could be the hero exploring the lost continent. There might still be dinosaurs. Science really was the stuff of fiction. But you could do it at home. My dad did. And that is why we were all not allowed to have chemistry sets as children. A small incident of him melting his grandfather's silver pocket watch in nitric acid, having taken it apart and being unable to put it back together. He needed to hide the evidence. Okay, my father wasn't always logical in his actions. Like when he sold my mother's car because my brother had made a passing comment, age 16, of how inspiring the Paris to Dakar rally was. My father was convinced that he and his friends would take the car one night and compete in the race. Quite how he would have managed to do so without a passport, support crew, the money needed, in a standard family saloon car from the mid-1980s was never truly explained by my father. It was just a father-ism. Later in life, he would look back on some of these things and laugh, having the insight that age brings to see his follies. He served in the RAF just post World War II, installing and servicing radar stations around the UK. But his childhood would have seen the development of monoplanes as interceptors. Movies like H.G. Wells' Things to Come would have inspired his young mind as much as media inspires ours today. But the design of the interceptor for the RAF is an interesting one. The late 1920s and early 1930s saw the RAF begin to make the change to the monoplane interceptor, and the Air Ministry's specification F-20-27 in an attempt to find what was better, the biplane or the low wing or the high wing, with Vickers, de Havilland and Westland being some of the main contenders. The names of Spitfire and Hurricane are not thought of yet. We might well have been speaking in awe of the Vickers Jockey or Venom or the DH-77. This period of time sees great advancements. While the Jockey, Venom, etc. were modern designs, in many ways they were very similar to their biplane relatives. The fixed landing gear would have produced a tremendous amount of drag. The idea of a top speed of 203 miles per hour seemed so fast. And yet, within 10 years of this, the Mark V Spitfire will be topping out at 370 miles per hour and the Mark II Hurricane at 340 miles per hour. In early 1931, the Air Ministry again put up a request for new designs, the F-7-30 calling for a modern fighter to serve the RAF. Amongst the many designs was Gloucester's entry, the Gladiator. With a top speed of 253 miles per hour, armed with two 303 Vickers in the fuselage and two 303 Lewis machine guns under each wing. Another entry was Supermarine's Type 224, designed by a young designer called R.J. Mitchell. The Type 224 was a bitter disappointment. Supermarine was sure they could do better, and Mitchell knew he could do better. In 1933, they asked the Air Ministry to reserve a name for the new design, Spitfire. 3 years later, The first prototype takes to the air on the 5th of March 1936. 2 years later, at the beginning of August, the Mark 1s are delivered to the RAF. The thing that made the difference, that unique spark, that without a doubt helped to save this nation in its darkest hours, was the engine. The powerhouse married to the perfect body that allowed the Night Defender to be born. If you ever heard the sound of a Merlin-powered Spitfire, you will know what I mean. Many years ago I was leading a group of scouts on an expedition in Upper Weardale when we were buzzed by a flight of 2 Spitfires inbound for Sunderland Air Show. The feeling of sheer joy as the aircraft passed us at low altitude was a talking point for the day. And this was the issue with the early attempts at the low-wing monoplane interceptor. The power plants were just not up to the task. The Merlin generated 1,470 horsepower, while the 1930 Vickers Jockey at best could match a third of that with 530 horsepower. The 1929 DH-77, contender for the role of the RAF frontline interceptor, was even less at 300 horsepower. Power, married to body, is everything when it comes to the interceptor. To be able to lift off the deck, the engines burning, and be at altitude and on station fast, is the key role for the model. But not just that, but to be able to fight. And in early 1930, there was a fighter that could do that, with an engine turning out 1,100 horsepower, armed with 2 7.62mm machine guns or 2 20mm cannons. A climb rate of 14.7 metres per second, far outstripping the Vickers Jockey 9.4 metres per second. The diminutive Polikarpov I-16 was the world's first cantilever monoplane with retractable landing gear to reach operational status. Called Ishak by its pilots, meaning donkey, the fighter was a handful to operate. The I-16s were seemingly inspired by either the Boeing P-26 or the GB Racers of the 1920s, and in both cases the assumptions are wrong. Created by the inspired Russian designer Nikolai Polikarpov, when working on the design for the I-15 biplane, he envisaged the idea for an advanced monoplane interceptor to be powered by the license-built Wright R1820 radial engine. The prototype began construction in June of 1933. By November of 1933, permission was given for the aircraft to go into production, and a month later, the TS KB-12 prototype first took to the air. Just under a year and a half later, the I-16 entered into service with the Soviet Air Force. The design had the backing of the major designers at the time. Andrei Tupolev helped push the design past the military academies, who at first thought it was unflyable. Then, with the backing of Pavel Shukov, the fighter went into production, and the aircraft had several features that were very advanced for the time. The ailerons could act like flaps, much in the way that modern aircraft have flaperons now. High-stress areas used metal as a covering, as with the leading edges of the wings and the spar and ribs in the construction of the aircraft body and wings, the rest relying on fabric to cover non-essential areas and wooden construction for ease and to reduce cost. The cockpit was armoured. In 1936, the Republican forces begged for fighter aircraft from anyone who would listen. After receiving a payment in gold, Joseph Stalin sent nearly 500 I-16s to Spain. They first appeared in the Spanish skies in November of that year. And on the 13th, they had their first combat when encountering a bombing raid inbound from Madrid. Shooting down 4 enemy aircraft that day, the Rata, as it became to be known, proved its worth. This small fighter ruled the skies for over a year. Nothing the nationalists flew could keep up with it, let alone dogfight with a small Soviet fighter. Late in 1937, a new monoplane appeared in the skies over Spain, and the days of the I-16 were numbered as a frontline fighter. That aircraft was the faster, better armed, more powerful Bf-109. By 1942, the I-16 was removed from frontline service. Its days were over. In its 8 years of production, over 10,000 were made. And as pre-World War II aircraft go, I have a bit of love for this aircraft. It just appeals to me. The small, squat shape and attitude I love. From all accounts, it was awful to fly. But at the time, it must have turned the heads of designers from other countries. And I've always loved Russian aircraft. Something about the design of them. A part of this channel that I'm enjoying more and more is the research. I never thought I would. In fact, when I first started writing, I never thought I'd be able to complete what I have. And that is a negative preset bias that I'm challenging. The history that I'm getting to learn is great. It is at times a real lift to my mood and depression that at times sinks me quite low. The long-term caring that I'm supplying for my mother is not easy. Getting to spend time with her at the end of her life is well worth the journey. And getting the opportunity to listen to her younger years and life. As she starts to relive them more vividly now. And we spend more time in a past that's nearly 70 years ago compared to the reality of now. It is almost a privilege, one that comes with a heavy price, but one that is worth paying. For you only get to walk this path once, and then it becomes history. The stories that my mother can share will only be known to those of us who know her and take the time to listen. So take the time and talk to your parents. Whether they are young or old, for all too soon that time will be gone.